Welcome to Torah Today Ministries. My name is Grant Luton.
And I'm Robin, and we are going to start the book of Deuteronomy.
Yes, the book Devarim. So this portion covers chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 22.
I've been excited about starting this book of
You have been.
Deuteronomy or words. Words are a big deal.
Yes.
And the word Devarim, or words, is very similar to another Hebrew word, which is Devarim,
which is spelled exactly the same. If you see it in a Torah scroll, they're spelled exactly the same. So it's Devarim and Devorim. It's just a little slight difference in the vowel. But so the book starts out, Ela Hadvarim, Asher Deber Moshe. These are the words that Moses Deber spoke. So Devarim, words, comes from the word Deber, to speak. But this word is found also in chapter 1, verse 44. So let's see if you can figure out which word it is.
Well, I know. It's the word bees, as in honeybees.
Yeah.
And what in the world does words have to do with bees?
Especially God's word.
Right.
Well, if you look at the opposite ends of a bee, out of one end comes honey, out of the mouth, but out of the other end comes a sting. And God's word has the same effect depending on how we approach it. God's word can sting like a bee, but they can also produce honey. In fact, throughout the scriptures, his word is compared to honey from the rock. So you don't have honey without bees. So God's word is dangerous. We need to be careful how we handle it.
And so are our words.
Absolutely.
Our words can bring life, or they can be a sting.
Yeah, they can be sweet or they can be painful.
Exactly. And I'm going to take the liberty to bounce back for a moment because
I knew you were going to do that.
Last week you skipped over the whole subject.
I know. And I haven't heard the end of it all week.
No, I haven't been that bad. But I didn't want to skip something important that really relates to where we're heading in this new book of Deuteronomy. In the book of Numbers, at the end of our portion the beginning of our last portion last time, Moses is speaking to the heads of the tribes of Israel. And he says, "This is the word which the Lord has commanded. And if a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to bind himself with a binding obligation, he shall not violate his word. He shall do everything according to the word that comes out of his mouth." And I pondered that because here's what has happened. We have lost the awareness of the importance of the words that come out of our mouth. We've lost the awareness of the importance of the words that come out of the mouth of God. He spoke to Moshe on Sinai, and those words were literally carved in stone so that they were heard, they were seen, they were felt, they were experienced. And then, of course, we know that the word became flesh and dwelt among us. And our Messiah walked the earth to proclaim the same words that Moses heard.
Right. And to live them out in the flesh.
Words matter, but we have become spiritually illiterate to such a great extent.
That's so true.
And I hear people say, well, you know what? I really don't like to read. I'm not interested in books. I'm really not interested.
And Satan applauds.
Well, this is the vehicle that God has chosen to communicate and to connect to us.
Yes.
And this is the way we connect to one another. How effective would this podcast be if we weren't sharing words right now?
That's right. And that is what sets us as human beings apart from the animals. We can speak to one another. And God has allowed us to bear his image in this way that we can speak, we can talk. And he spoke the world into existence. We can't do that.
It's such a heavy responsibility.
But our words can impact the spiritual realm in one another.
Yes.
While you were talking, Robin, I think of that phrase, and I use it often, talk is cheap. Because people say things and you learn not to just trust everything everybody says.
Because words don't mean what they say anymore.
But on the other hand, words are very expensive, and every word, every idle word we speak will be rehearsed and replayed, and there'll be a price to pay for every word we say. So speech is very expensive as well.
There's a fascinating passage, and I'm just going to take a moment. I'm getting back at you for last week. Hosea 14, the first few verses, it's so intriguing. It says, "Return, O Israel, to the Lord your God, for you have stumbled because of your iniquity. Take words with you and return to the Lord. Say to him, take away all the iniquity and receive us graciously, that we may present the words of our lips, the fruit of our lips." So here is a passage that tells us that when we have distance between ourselves and our Creator, we begin to stumble, and until we can return to him and hear his words and allow him to put his words in us, we have no words to offer back to him or anyone around us. It's fascinating.
That's right.
And then in James, I will finish with this, we're reminded how important it is when we make oaths and promises and use our vocal cords to express what's in our soul. And in James 5, verse 12, it says, above all things, don't swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath. Let your yes be yes and your no be no, that you may not fall under judgment. Why is this such a dire warning? Because our words express our heart. And if we say that we can swear by heaven or earth, we're claiming ownership of something that we don't own.
That's right.
And we're being reminded, you don't own heaven, you don't own earth. You are to take ownership of what you say.
True. And you know, people who are reliable and speak the truth, they don't have to say, I swear,
those people.
I swear I'm telling the truth. I swear. Only people whose words usually are false are the ones who have to take all kinds of oaths to impress upon you. I'm really telling the truth.
No, seriously, I mean it. I swear by blah, 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 blah. Really, I mean it. Or even a mother who says, I mean it. I'm going to say this one more time. No, just one more time. I really mean it.
And so they're teaching their children to lie.
And they're teaching their children that words don't mean anything.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
But God's words mean what they say. Yeah. And we're in his image, and our words need to express the truth.
So, referring to this book of the Torah called Words, Devarim, it's interesting that it is quoted more often in the apostolic scriptures than any other book of the Torah. It's quoted over 80 times.
And most times by Yeshua, he quoted Deuteronomy more than any other book.
Yes, and when he was being tested by the enemy in the wilderness,
it was this book.
It was only Deuteronomy that he quoted.
So let's set it up. What's happening in this book? Moses is addressing the people, and let's describe what he's doing and why.
Well, the 40 years of wandering are over. They're right on the bank of the Jordan River opposite the city of Jericho. Moses realizes he's going to be dying very soon, and the idea is that this book is what he spoke to Israel on the last day of his life.
Can you imagine?
Now, he may have done this over a period of a few days, but I like to
read
picture
that it was a little bit of like a number of days, but it was intense.
But this is his final speech before he dies. The reins are passed to Joshua, and Joshua leads them across. So it's a review of the last 40 years from the time they were in Egypt until now. And you know, the name Deuteronomy comes from the Greek deuteros, which means double, or let's get the word ditto, double something, and namos, which means law, which is a horrible name for Torah. Torah means instruction. But Deuteronomy, double law, or the second law. The Jews refer to this as the Mishneh Torah, the repetition of the Torah.
I've also seen it mentioned as the book of Musar,
yes,
which is the book of rebuke and reminders and instruction.
Yes. It's almost like your kids are getting ready to go off to college, and you realize they're going to be completely on their own for the first time, and you're just trying to pour all the advice, remind them of all the things, remind them of who they are.
And let's review what our
Yes.
family's been through together,
That's right.
what the lessons we've learned, and this is my
That's
last
right.
advice to give you before you go off
Yes.
on your own and live grown-up life.
Now, there's one other misconception people have that we need to clear up that will make this book come alive, and that is this. You know, growing up in the Baptist church, we always think of the promised land as being heaven. And there are songs about crossing
Canaan.
over into
Yeah.
Canaan land.
Right.
And we think we finally will cross the Jordan, which is death, like the river Styx. And then we then get to enter into Canaan land where everything's just easy peasy. But Canaan was going to be a place of battles and work and sowing and reaping and harvesting, all of that.
And building.
Yes. So we have to understand Canaan is not a picture of the world to come. It's a picture of the victorious life of the disciple here and now. And as we were talking before, there are parts of my life that are in Canaan, and they're victorious and they're productive and fruitful. There are parts of me that are still dying in the wilderness because God's saying, that can't go across.
And that's the whole point of the wilderness, is to put to death the things that
Yes.
need to go.
And for a lot of believers, and probably for me too, there are parts of me still in Egypt, still in slavery, that God hasn't even pointed out to me yet, says, this has got to be redeemed. This has got to be set free. So the older I get, I'm hoping that there's less and less of me in Egypt and less of me in the wilderness and more of me that's gone over into Canaan, a place of action and a place of rest and a place of victory and fruitfulness.
I tell you what's really crazy about all of this is our spiritual self is so much more complex than even our physical self.
Oh, yes.
And there are parts of me, Grant, that taste Canaan, but then cross back over, and I find myself struggling again with the same old, same old.
Well, how many times were they tested in the wilderness? Instead of saying, oh man, everybody, let's keep moving on, let's get over to Canaan, they said, oh, everybody, let's go back to Egypt. We want to go to what's familiar instead of what God says is best for us.
Well, the enemies that are overcome in order to cross over into Canaan or the Promised Land, they are mentioned over and over again, is Sihon and Og.
10 times they're mentioned.
And we talked about how we have to overcome our personal comfort. And I kind of think of it in terms of preferences. I have my personal preferences about how things should look and feel, and I kind of go back to that, and that becomes my place of just running back to hide when I don't like what is happening around me.
Let me just run through a list. I have 7 things that I kind of describe the kind of people go to Canaan, the kind of believer who lives the victorious and fruitful life. First of all, it's only a redeemed people. People have been redeemed by the blood and body of the Lamb. A redeemed people have been passed from death to life, from slavery to freedom. Second, it's a tested people. In the wilderness, they were tested. That was the purpose of the wilderness, of the manna. It was all for testing the people. Third, it has to be a Torah people, because in the wilderness is where God spoke his Torah. That's his discipleship manual for the redeemed life. It's the handbook for how to be a true human being.
But it's so important to remember that in Deuteronomy 1:6, when they were at Mount Horeb and they received the Torah there at Sinai, there was a point where God said, you stayed long enough here, take what I've spoken to you,
live it out,
and move on.
Yes, because they while they're at Sinai, God gave the Torah, but they also built a tabernacle. God made a home among them.
And how tempting it was for them to think, okay, we've arrived.
Yeah, this is home now.
No more tests, no more trials.
This is not a home, this is a mobile home, and we're going to go places.
And there's a purpose for everything we've learned.
Yes. And so the fourth thing, and this happened at Sinai, is the whole red heifer. Not red heifer, but the golden calf. And so only a broken people people have learned that I am broken. I have a lot of repair that needs to be done in my life. A humble, broken people, but also a courageous people. That's number 5. Only courageous people make it to Canaan. Fearful people can't go in. It's impossible. They won't go in. They're not allowed to go in. Number 6, a faithful and trusting people. You know, that first generation, they came up to Jericho. They believed the evil report of the 10 spies. They murmured in their tents. They whined. They complained. And they were ready to stone the 2 courageous, faithful, trusting people, Joshua and Caleb, because they said, come on, folks, we can do this. And as a result, those people, that whole generation, died in the wilderness.
And this is the whole promise fulfilled that he gave Abraham way back when he made a covenant. This was the place he had promised to bring the people.
Well, see, Abraham was all these things. God said, leave everything familiar, leave your family, follow me into a land I'll show you. Abraham pulled up stakes and followed God.
And Sarah went with him.
And Sarah went. and so cool. We have to have the faith of Abraham. But the 7th one is a victorious people. They could not cross into the promised land until they conquered Sihon and Og, as you mentioned. And they're mentioned 10 times, because this is something the scriptures are so emphatic about. Sihon represents human reasoning. Og represents human comfort. And if our lives are controlled by our own human reasoning and logic, and by our own addiction to comfort, we could never serve God in fruitfulness and victory. We can't go into the promised land, because they were the guardians of the border, and you had to conquer them before you could go over the Jordan into the promised land.
So in summarizing kind of what God has in store for his people, if we're courageous enough to follow in there, it's a place of holiness or set apartness. It's a place of victory, and it's a place of fruitfulness.
Absolutely.
And my eyes are landing on Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 21, where Moses reminds them. He's saying, see, the Lord your God has placed the land before you. Go up, take possession as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has spoken to you. Do not fear or be dismayed.
Yes.
This was the point where they said, okay, but how about if we send some spies ahead?
Yeah, they had this bright idea. They were still fearful. And those spies, 10 of the 12, are what discouraged the hearts of the people.
And you know what, I'm sorry, but I laugh because if I go down a few verses, then they got discouraged because they let what they were afraid of rule their decision making. And Moses says, and then you grumbled in your tents. So then they started to discourage each other. And then you said, because the Lord hates us. He brought us out of the land of Egypt to deliver us into the hand of Amorites and destroy us. And I'm reminded of a 4-year-old who, as a good parent who loves them with all your, we love our kids with all of our heart, and we try to give them what they need and what is good for them and what's even going to keep them alive. And they'll stomp their foot and say, you hate me. Because they don't understand it.
Yeah. Because it conflicts with their own idea of what good and pleasure is.
Right.
Well, something's interesting about this wilderness. It felt hateful to them. But the wilderness itself, was a manifestation of God. I want everybody to notice something. In Deuteronomy 1:19, it says, we journeyed from Horeb and went through that entire Hagadol v'Hanora, a great and awesome wilderness. And it's called that a number of times.
It's
the great
his
and awesome
designated place.
Yeah, but God is also called the great and awesome God.
So it's an extension of him.
It's a manifestation of God.
Wow.
Everything they encountered in the wilderness was a manifestation of God himself. And another principle, what we fear concerning the land will befall us in the wilderness. They feared going across because there are giants there that will kill us. So what did they do? They died in the wilderness. We can't go across there because our children will die. Well, they died, but the children went across. Everything they feared about the land befell them in the wilderness.
And you know, the lie we tell ourselves, Grant, is that he is forgetting us.
Yeah.
That somehow what we're experiencing in the wilderness or in life is outside of his knowledge, his love, his control. In our passage here in chapter 2, it says in 7, "For the Lord your God has placed you in all that you've done. He has known your wanderings through this great wilderness. These 40 years the Lord your God has been with you. You have not lacked a thing."
Yes,
it's all
that's right.
ordained.
Yeah.
Even their stubbornness and self-imposed battles that weren't necessary, God says, okay, suddenly this is plan A. Because this is what you need for me to bring you to the place where you can experience Canaan.
Yes, that's right.
It's so easy to sit here and talk about it, Grant, but it's so easy to forget it.
But before the sun goes down, we'll be tested in some of these ways.
And we get uncomfortable, and we get all nervous and doubtful and fretful, and we fear.
Well, you know, several times in the wilderness, they wanted to go back to Egypt because they were afraid of the land. And one of the principles I wrote down is if we refuse to follow God into the unknown, the known will become hateful to us.
Explain that.
The land of Canaan was unknown to them. And they were afraid to go into what was unknown.
Yeah.
Instead of trusting God who knows the land where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, their forefathers, dwelled and prospered, instead of trusting God to go into what was unknown to them, they stayed in the wilderness and what was familiar. What was familiar became hateful.
Well, I'm reminded of, we've had the conversation about climbing the ladder. There's that spiritual ladder that we're required to climb. And the rungs, each one that goes higher, away from the world and from what is safe and familiar, but yet physical, completely physical. It takes us to a place we haven't been before.
It does.
And it's so tempting to go back to base camp, isn't it?
Yeah, courageous people are willing to go into the unknown because of a higher calling, because of orders that come from above, from their general in the army, or from God, from the Word. And they're willing to squash their own fears and say, I'm going to do this.
I remember
but people who can't do that never find fulfillment and joy in their lives.
Well, part of the problem is we want to see the top of the mountain and understand everything that's waiting for us. And we're kind of climbing a mountain without a top in this world.
Can we send some spies up to see it first?
We have to be willing to keep climbing even though we can't see the top yet, and know that it's there. And it's great.
Yes. So we have a choice. Do I trust what my eyes see, my mind comprehends, or do I trust the God who has redeemed me from Egypt? And I choose to trust the God who's redeemed me from Egypt, who says he loves me, has my best at heart, and he's going to hold me through this, so I can trust him and have faith, or I can fear the future. And you know what? I'm convinced more and more that you're either a true believer or you're a coward. You can't be both. So if you believe, you're not going to operate in fear. If you operate in fear, then you're not a believer. I just don't understand how the two can coexist.
Well, I believe, but sometimes I have to ask God to help my unbelief.
Yes.
Because there are little areas that I forget, and then I have to learn again.
And we get wobbly.
And he loves us, and he comes alongside, and he takes us through the experience in the wilderness that we need in order to make us stronger and braver.
And we get double-souled. You know, and James says the double-souled man is unstable in all his ways. So I'll have fits of courage, and then it's like, oh, run away, you know. But we have to become more stable, more dependable, more faithful.
So what I'm hearing us say, tell me if we're right.
Tell me
I
what
think
I'm
we're
talking
saying,
about.
first of all, don't settle. Keep moving forward.
Yes.
Keep climbing upward. And the other thing I'm hearing us say, as a result of what we believe God is saying through this portion, is be intentional.
Yes.
Be intentional about it. Have a plan.
Yeah.
Move on.
Yeah.
Move up.
Yeah.
And don't be dismayed.
That's right. Be strong and courageous.
Sounds like some of the verses that Moses tells the people along the way here.
Strong, yeah. You know, in chapter 2, verse 3, I know this is something you want to talk about, where Adonai speaks to Moses, and Adonai said to me, saying, verse 3, enough of your circling this mountain.
Yeah.
Turn yourselves northward.
Right.
That word northward is interesting. It's the word Zaphona. And the word Zaphona means north, but it also means hidden. In other words, leave the familiar. You're orbiting around the familiar. It's getting kind of boring. Go into the unknown. I'm going to lead you into the unknown.
Well,
that's where you get across to Canaan.
This was Mount Seir. And this mountain was pretty close to where they needed to get to, but they thought it was good enough, right? And he's like, look, you've come this far.
Yes.
Just trust me to cross over and build. I keep thinking, like you said earlier, how the people have reached this age of maturity to where it was time to take everything they knew and grow up and begin to build a life, because they weren't going to wake up and find manna on the ground every morning.
Yes.
They weren't going to get water from a rock every day.
That's right.
They had to dig wells.
That's right.
They had to build houses.
Yeah.
They had to make a life according to everything that God had spoken to them and taught them in the wilderness.
That's right.
It was time to grow up and quit being an adolescent.
That's right. That's so true. Yeah. Oh. It's so easy to see it in the Word, but like you said, when it comes to the day-to-day, just to see it and say, okay, we'll be faithful. I'm going to learn and practice what I learned in Deuteronomy today.
And you know what else I saw? I saw that it's important not to assume or misunderstand that the majority is the enlightened group. Because it got to the point where it was Joshua and Caleb who were saying, come on, guys, don't be afraid. And the majority of the people of that first generation didn't have what it took. And so now it's time for their children to rehearse everything that their parents failed to put into practice. But it is so tempting in this world of religious systems to look around and think, well, I'm part of a group and the group's pretty big and they're telling me that this is good enough, so I'm just going to stay here and circle this mountain.
Well, we tend to find our security in the majority. We like to be in the majority because it feels secure. But as you read the Word of God from Genesis to Revelation, it's never the majority that's right. The minority are the brave and the courageous.
Now, we don't want to be cult members.
No, we don't want to be rebels. But we have to find our security, not in the majority, but find our security in God.
Yes.
And if we do that, and if you're doing that, and these other people are doing it, we find a lot of people who find their security in God. But the moment I take my eyes off of Him and start finding my security because I'm surrounded by a bunch of people, then I'm starting to fall down that ladder. I'm starting to go backwards.
Well, this picture of a group of people who appear to be the majority takes me back to the golden calf incident.
Yes.
And they built a golden calf, and I think that
the tribe of Levi did not participate.
Exactly. But I think that calf mentality sort of stayed with them through the wilderness, and they had to fight against it. And then here they are, right at the point of crossing over. And what does this generation say? Well, two of the tribes said, our livestock is comfortable here. And to me, that harkened back. It's like they just have a hang up over cows. They had the golden calf that really messed them up, because it became a religious system to replace the God that they couldn't see. Then they said, but we're using that gold and we've accumulated cattle for ourselves. This is good enough.
Yes.
This is our God now. And
God forgave them. And God forgave them for that. As horrible as that sin was, there weren't as many people who died from that sin as from the sin of refusing to go across the Jordan because they believe the evil report of the 10 spies. There, the whole generation died. That was the most wicked, evil thing that they did during the 40 years.
Well, we are a species created to worship.
Yes, we are.
That is how He created us. And we will worship something, and if we don't respond to the divine creator, we are going to create something or worship the creation itself, but he is no thing.
That's right.
He's not a golden calf, and he's not a group of cattle. He's the God of the Word.
Yes, he is. You know, it's one thing that's worth noting is in chapter 2, verse 17. It says, Adonai spoke to me. That's the word deber. He spoke to me.
There's that word again.
Now, what's interesting is the rabbis notice that this is the first time that God has spoken, that word appears, that God has spoken since the whole failure of the spies.
Really?
You find many places where it says Vayomer, and God said. And other places where it's Vaidaber, and God spoke. And this word spoke has not been used over the last 38 years. But now with the new generation, now that old generation has passed away, God now speaks in this more intentional and intimate way.
And let's see what he says. He says, today,
yes,
you shall cross over.
Yes.
It's time.
Yeah.
Here and now, do it. You're ready.
Yeah.
And crossing over, that word cross over, that's what the word Hebrew itself means.
So I want to read a little snippet from Psalm 81, starting in verse 10. I, Adonai, am your God, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it. But my people did not listen to my voice, and Israel were not willing to obey me. So I gave them over to the stubbornness of their heart, to walk in their own devices. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. I would quickly subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their adversaries. Those who hate Adonai would pretend obedience to him, and their season will be for an age. But I would feed you with fat of the wheat and with davash, with honey from the rock. I would satisfy you. The people in the wilderness experienced the sting of the bee. But God says, I want to fill you with the honey.
It was the land flowing with
milk and honey.
With milk and honey. And when the spies did go over and came back afraid, they brought something with them. They brought beautiful, ripe, delicious
here's proof of the truth of what this land is.
Yet their fear overcame their ability to see and know the goodness of what God had in store for them. We do this.
I know.
This is the word to us today. And I'm sitting here thinking, what are the areas of my life where I don't sense victory or I don't sense fruitfulness? I'm doubting. I'm doubting the word that he has given me.
Well, what we tend to do is exactly what James describes. Maybe this would be a good place to end unless you have something else that you want to share.
We'll just see if I feel like it's the place to
But in James 1, it says in verse 22, prove yourselves doers of the word and not merely hearers who delude themselves. Because if we just hear the word, we delude ourselves into thinking we're doers. And the next verse says, for if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks at his natural face in a mirror. For once he has looked at himself and gone away, he has immediately forgotten what kind of person he was. And so here we are. We're looking into the word, and as you and I have said several times, it's like, yes, I get it. This is what I want to do. But we close our Bibles. You all turn off the podcast. You go about your day. And it's like we've looked at who we are in the mirror, and we see who God is and who we are, but then we walk away from the mirror and then we fall right back into our everyday fears and insecurities and faithlessness. Can we hold on to what we've heard this morning, what we've heard, what we've read, and say, I am going to be strong. I am going to be courageous. I am going to follow God into the unknown he has for me. I'm going to believe in him more than in my own human reason, which makes me afraid. I'm going to trust what God says, then my emotions about what the world says, what my eyes see. So let's not be forgetful hearers. So we've looked into the mirror. We see the truth. Can we walk in it once we step away from the mirror? That's the question. Can we remember in the dark what we saw in the light?
I am so encouraged by what you just said, and I'm going to take it just a step further.
I knew you would.
Because it's my job as your wife. He wants us to be doers and not just hearers.
Yes.
But he also wants us to stop thinking that it's enough to go through motions and just do the instructions.
Yes.
He wants it to become who we are.
Yeah.
And a good friend and I were taking a walk last night, and she kept saying, you know, Robin, the difference between the life we're trying to leave behind and the place we're trying to dwell in is Shabbat and just knowing his instructions in our heart because it's written on our heart. It isn't just something we do. And people get weary when they're just trying to go through motions and do something.
Circling the mountain.
Circling the mountain. She says he wants us to be this.
Yes.
We have to become this.
Yes.
And I believe that's what Canaan is. We become not human doers, but true human beings made in his image, to where who he is who we become.
Yeah.
And I started, I mentioned Hosea in the chapter 14, the first few verses earlier when we were talking about words. I'm going to take us to the end of chapter 14 of Hosea and read verse 9, because this, I think, really summarizes the heart of what we're trying to share this morning. And once again, we're not trying to share this because we think that we need people to understand what we understand. This is a message to you and I.
Yeah.
And every day we look at
That's
each other and try to remind each other of these things.
Yes.
But verse 9 in Hosea 14, whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever's discerning, let him know them. For the words, the ways, the instructions of the Lord are right, and the righteous will walk in them, but transgressors will stumble in them. The same words that can be honey and sweetness can be a sting to those who reject it, and it becomes the stumbling block.
That's right. Enough said. I think it's a perfect way, Robin, to end this parsing the portion session.
Well, I'm excited to move on in Deuteronomy and see where this final part of the journey takes us.
That's right. So until next time, we wish you shalom and may God bless.
Shalom.
Thank you for joining us for today's teaching. If the work of Torah Today Ministries has touched your life, please consider making a donation or sponsoring an upcoming video. As a video sponsor, you'll have an exclusive opportunity to memorialize a family member, celebrate a special event, or simply support the ongoing creation of similar content. Your tax-deductible contribution helps ensure that our teachings continue to reach all who are longing for truth. Click the link or visit our website to learn more.